If I was to refer to a shadowy think tank in Southern California, I am willing to bet that some of you out there will instantly know who I'm referring to. It's an organization that's been accused of promoting plans for US expansionism and interference with foreign governments. It has even been called, quote, more dangerous than the CIA. I am, of course, talking about the RAND Corporation, set up by the United States Air Force following the Second World War to act as an independent consultant. Over the years since, the think tank is known to have been involved in the development of a great deal of American policy and strategy, especially regarding the Soviet Union, but it has been implicated in far more. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at what we do know about the RAND Corporation, specifically the role they played in the 1950s. This is the Cold War. So, today's episode largely takes place in the California sunshine, but it starts at 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, at the White Sands Proving Ground in the New Mexico desert. The Trinity test was the culmination of the years of work that had gone into the Manhattan Project, ushering in the atomic age. The Manhattan Project, as I think almost every one of you watching already knows, was a government-led and funded project. And for the real detail-oriented among you, you will notice that I said the story starts at 5:30 a.m. and not 5:29 a.m., the exact time of the Trinity detonation. This is because that's about how long it took for men like United States Army Air Force General Henry Hap Arnold to begin to realize that with the conclusion of the war, the massive government-led funding of research teams like the Manhattan Project would begin to come to an end. Understanding that an authoritarian government like the Soviet Union, already well recognized by members of the US military as a future adversary, could command large-scale cross-disciplinary projects with relative ease compared to what would be possible in peacetime America, Arnold looked to find a way to keep teams of ideas men together to tackle both operational research as well as intellectual challenges that could then be leveraged by the US government if needed. Arnold, in a September 1945 conversation with Frank Kohlbaum, a senior executive at the Douglas Aircraft Corporation, came to the conclusion that he was not alone in his fears of falling behind the Soviet Union in the ability to harness and direct the scientific community towards projects of national interest. The two men quickly worked to bring in other like-minded thinkers, many from Douglas, including Donald Douglas himself. Within days of that initial conversation, a meeting took place at Hamilton Air Force Base, and Project RAND, short for Research and Development, was formed, funded by an allocated but unspent $10 million the USAAF had in its research budget, deemed enough to keep the body operating for at least a few years. It was agreed that RAND would be a civilian body to keep it free of direct government oversight and involvement, and that its purpose would be to bring different minds together to aid in the development of new weapons. We should point out here that Project RAND was structurally a part of Douglas Aircraft Company. Douglas was the largest military contractor to the Air Force, and their design teams and operational research teams had been working closely with the Air Force throughout the war, so this was a natural extension. But what did Project RAND do? Following the September meeting, things drifted a bit, as there was no clear aim or purpose for Project RAND. Nobody quite knew what, quote, develop new weapons really meant. Letters and memos moved back and forth trying to figure that out, but it was the appointment of General Curtis LeMay in December of 1945 to the post of Air Force Deputy Chief of Air Staff for Research and Development when things really began to pick up steam. Yes, this is the same Curtis LeMay who had led the firebombing campaign against Japan earlier that year, and it was his headstrong and direct personality that really gave RAND the organizational push it needed. Like a bull in a china shop, one that happened to clench a cigar in its mouth, LeMay pushed through the red tape to make sure RAND was set up to be an asset to the Air Force. He even reportedly locked a group of bureaucrats in a room and wouldn't let them out until they had come to an agreement on their budgetary process. By March, RAND had its mission. Quote, Project RAND is a continuing program of scientific study and research on the broad subject of air warfare with the object of recommending to the Air Force preferred methods, techniques, and instrumentalities for this purpose. End quote. And a key part of that mission statement is the part that says its object was to recommend to the Air Force. RAND was a civilian organization staffed by civilians, but absolutely subservient to the Air Force. I feel it's important to point out at this point that RAND was very much an American solution to a more global challenge. All major powers struggled with how best to coordinate research with operational needs. The Soviet Union, as already mentioned, was an authoritarian state and able to dictate where and how resources, including specific individuals, would be allocated. The state had full control over the direction any plans would take. Other nations, like France and Great Britain, nationalized their planning, bringing it under government control, but not to the degree of the USSR. The United States, at the other end of the spectrum, solved the issue by setting up a private firm, free from direct government interference. The funding for RAND still came exclusively from the government, but RAND employees were allowed wide latitude to explore and develop ideas and produce material that the government could either like or, well, not like. So, what type of projects was Project RAND being asked to explore? Well, LeMay requested them to look into options for launching a satellite into orbit. The Air Force was looking for ways to leverage control over the development of nascent ICBM technology, not only to counter the Soviets, but to outmaneuver the Navy and the Army, each with their own rocket projects. It took RAND only a month to come back with their analysis titled, quote, "Preliminary Design of an Experimental World-Circling Spaceship." In the report, RAND prophetically advocated the use of multiple-stage rockets, suggested further studies on alcohol liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen liquid oxygen as propellants, and also outlined many of the eventual uses of satellites, including weather forecasting, communications, spying, and propaganda. The report was used to help cancel the Navy's missile project, solidifying the Air Force's control over a significant piece of the budgetary pie. And importantly, RAND had quickly demonstrated its value. By 1948, however, Douglas Aircraft Corp was having second thoughts about the position of RAND as a part of its organization. Douglas was worried that recommendations on new equipment and ideas would be perceived as a conflict of interest that would prevent Douglas from being able to secure the lucrative defense contracts on which its finances relied. In May of 1948, the RAND Corporation was incorporated as a non-profit, and by the end of the year, the USAF contract had been formally transferred from Douglas Aircraft Company to the RAND Corporation. It was now a fully independently operating think tank with the USAF as its sole client, although it was free to take other contracts as well if it so chose. Along with this new designation came a new mission statement: to further and promote scientific, educational, and charitable purposes, all for the public welfare and security of the United States of America. RAND was already freeing itself from being just a weapons incubator, to use the words of historian Alex Abella. The early years of the RAND Corporation were dominated by several key themes and factors. One was the unwavering belief of its employees of the greatness of the American Republic. This was a self-fulfilling confidence that the United States was a bastion of freedom, of democracy, and that it could do no wrong in the world as it stood up to the evils of global communism. National and global events certainly helped to drive the thinking at RAND. Its early years witnessed such events as the communist victory in China and the establishment of the PRC, the outbreak of the Korean War, the Soviet detonation of RDS-1, their first atomic bomb, the trials of Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, and other atomic spies, and of course HUAC, McCarthyism, and the ongoing Second Red Scare. The combination of this unwavering belief in American superiority and the perceived threat of enemies abroad served to polarize things at RAND. Moderate voices were not only sidelined, but were driven out, leaving the hawks in charge. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment, but first, a bit of background on the approach RAND had to its work. In the very early days of the think tank, much of the work was focused on mathematics, physics, and other quantifiable analysis, nuts and bolts kinds of things. However, it did not take long for RAND to start to take a more ambitious approach in its analysis by wanting to take into account the human factor, or how to account for human decision making. To that end, social science and economics divisions were established, and the best and brightest minds from across America were recruited to come to California and get paid to, well, think. Tools like the prisoner's dilemma and game theory were popular at RAND as they provided a framework through which employees could game out scenarios, using logic and rationality as the key deciding factors in any given situation. Rational decision-making was seen as the key to all human decisions, with RAND thinkers basing their analysis on the unchallenged idea that people, that human factor, will always make a rational decision. Systems analysis, the antecedent to policy analysis, which would be instituted by Robert McNamara at the DoD during the Kennedy administration, had its own roots in this as it looked to, quote, identify its goals and purposes and create systems and procedures that will efficiently achieve them. First developed in 1947 by RAND engineer Ed Paxson, systems analysis differed from operation research, what had been done during the Second World War, by changing the question being asked from what can we do with what we have to what do we want to be able to do and what do we need to build or invent in order to achieve that goal. In the words of Alex Abella, quote, systems analysis addressed the far more complex problem of choice among alternative systems that had yet to be designed, where the degrees of freedom and uncertainty are large, and where the difficulty is deciding both what to do and how to do it. Ambitious, to say the least. RAND analysts worked on a multitude of projects, many focused on things like military logistics and the important things that actually win wars. But the most prominent field where this attention was turned was in the burgeoning field of nuclear theory. Three RAND analysts stand out for the scope and impact of their work, as well as the differences in their views. All were working for the same organization: Bernard Brodie, Albert Wohlstetter, and Herman Kahn. Brodie had been a naval strategist before and during the war, before taking up a position at Yale University. During this time, he wrote The Absolute Weapon, Atomic Power and World Order, where he theorized that the true value of atomic weapons was not their actual destructive force, but rather the threat of their destructive force. It was in this book that Brodie wrote the rather famous line, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them." Brodie left Yale and moved to California to join RAND in 1951, where his work concluded that preventative war, a strike against an opponent designed to stop a war breaking out later, could only lead to full escalation due to the likelihood that an opponent would still be able to strike back, causing unacceptable loss of life and damage. Brodie thus advocated for a second strike capability and widespread civil defense measures to ensure the protection of vulnerable assets, especially people. He also called for retaliatory strikes, if they were to be conducted, to be targeted at military installations and not civilian targets like cities. The idea was to provide an off-ramp to de-escalation in order to preserve human populations. So, Brodie's thoughts were that as long as one side had the ability to still strike back after an initial nuclear attack, the rational decision is to not launch that first attack. Atomic and nuclear weapons are therefore deterrent measures. Brodie's ideas are seen in such things as hardened ICBM silos and submarine-based nuclear missiles, which are very difficult to guarantee the destruction of. This is all outlined in his 1959 book, written while at RAND, Strategy in the Missile Age. Albert Wohlstetter, a mathematician and philosopher of science, joined RAND in the early 1950s, first as a consultant and then full-time. His first major impact was a sweeping study of how the USAF needed to move its bombers and missiles farther away from the Soviet Union in order to reduce the risk of having to use those bombers. This was based on the conclusion that the vulnerability of having bombers based close to the Soviet Union increased the likelihood of having to launch them all at once in the event of an incident, just in case it was a widespread attack so they didn't get caught on the ground. Wohlstetter recommended basing bombers and missiles as far from the Soviet borders as possible to prevent a war. This study, which Kurt LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command at the time, rejected outright, was actually eventually adopted by the USAF once LeMay and SAC had had some time to make some changes and adopt it as their own plan rather than Wohlstetter and RAND's. Wohlstetter, like Brodie, believed in the deterrence value of nuclear weapons and second strike capability as the best way of keeping the peace. Wohlstetter was a prolific writer at RAND and did much to spread the ideas of deterrence theory to politicians and the wider public. Now, our third analyst stood apart from Brodie and Wohlstetter. Herman Kahn, Dr. Strangelove himself, joined RAND in 1947 and rose to prominence by daring to think about the unthinkable and then being a showman about it. The unthinkable in this case was how to win a nuclear war. Asking questions like, if 180 million dead is too high a price for punishing the Soviets for their aggression, what price would we be willing to pay? Kahn looked for ways that the United States could win by switching the equations. Of a population of 200 million, 30 million dead still meant 170 million survivors. The solution then was civil defense. Bomb shelters, whether that be government built, provided by Vault-Tec, or maybe just a mine shaft somewhere. Mind the gap. Kahn was actually the theorist that brought the term second strike to the public consciousness, rebranding the idea he borrowed, or stole, from Brody. Kahn's 1960 book On Thermonuclear War served as an inspiration for Stanley Kubrick's classic film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Dr. Strangelove even worked for the Bland Corporation, you will remember. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, probably right around the Kennedy administration, whose ranks, especially at the DoD, were filled with people who had spent time working at RAND. They quickly became known as the whiz kids. Dedicated to using statistical analysis, data, and logic to drive their decisions, they moved to change how the government functioned, especially in the procurement of weapons systems. This created a great deal of conflict with the DoD, who had, prior to this, largely been able to pursue weapons platforms as they deemed necessary with the share of the budget that they had been allocated. It was also during the Kennedy years that RAND analysts, rooted in their belief that America could not misstep or do wrong, developed their ideas on how the United States needed to expand their involvement in Southeast Asia and the struggle against global communism. But all of that is best left to a future episode. This is ostensibly an episode about a think tank, but it's more than that. It's one that synthesizes much about the Cold War in America in the 1950s. It's about the role of government and business in leading the nation. It's about nuclear policy and how that was being shaped and guided. It's about how America saw itself in the world and the roles it assumed it could take. RAND, made up of a group of academics, were at the forefront of all of this. We're going to come back to RAND in the future, so to make sure you don't miss it, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is hiding in a mineshaft somewhere in West Virginia, hoping to be among the lucky winners of nuclear war. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.